As the coalition forces had had outstanding success in the Austin battle and had effectively cleared the route as they were supposed to do according to the original invasion plans, PLA Group Armies 7 through 13, one of the external invasion prongs, had by 1 p.m. successfully passed through I-35 and had made it through the Austin area without any issues. This occurred literally 30 minutes after the kill box in Creedmoore had been conducted by the battalion of PAP forces operating in the area. As there was now, later on day one, near the end of the day, another threat about to emerge. There was a grouping that was several thousand in strength that was atop the Edwards Plateau, and this was a militia-type force that was actually known about, as all of these other groups were, through the cyber warfare arm of the PLA, as they had outstanding intelligence gathering means, and they used the hacked information from the former American regime that was about to fall to obtain all the information on all these groups, as the American regime naturally spied on them. So the coalition now had all the information on these large militia-type groups, and were already annihilating many of them on day one in battle. And this group, in effect, was actually to be hunted down on day two. As the coalition had effectively secured the entire battle space, they were now preparing to push out from their primary battle space to secondary areas, as the invasion was not over yet. It was only day one. And as the forces consolidated in their original areas of operations, i.e. preparing megafobs and effectively ensuring that there was no more resistance, they would prepare to send some of their forces out to begin to clear secondary areas and then finally move on to tertiary areas after the American regime had capitulated and formally surrendered. For the time being, however, the coalition Trojan shock forces would, after consolidating control over their primary operation areas, expand their perimeter and move outward. As part of this plan, to the south, there was a Russian Spetznas battalion operating alongside of the Russian 2nd Combined Arms Army. It was not part of the 2nd Combined Arms Army, but it was attached to it, along with a VVS helicopter wing to carry them into battle with the very upgraded and advanced Mi-35M, which was a far more advanced version of the original Mi-24 Hind. This was a reserve VVS unit that was called up with their helos to participate in this invasion, and they operated extensively during the very short San Antonio battle, as there were many air bases to subdue, and the Russian Spetznas forces of the 70th Special Purposes Detachment, as their battalion was officially named, in other words, the 70th Spetznas Battalion, but it was called officially, in official terms, the 70th Special Purposes Detachment. These forces were to effectively combine their efforts with the People's Armed Police, who were experts in crushing insurgencies, as they had done so over many years every time bad actors to the Chinese, in other words, resistance fighters, smuggled in weapons and other personnel into Xinjiang to try to fight the CCP regime. The PAP had become experts in brutally annihilating all resistance, and this included insurgents, and they were also equipped to take on regular military forces. Their wheeled vehicles in the form of their armored fighting vehicles of the standard PAP forces, although they had very powerful, heavier, track-based forces, but their wheel-based forces gave them a high degree of mobility and firepower, and were also relatively decently armored vehicles as well, in the form of the WZ-551 IFV version and APC versions with their heavy machine gun mounts and further turrets. These were elite infantry paramilitary troops as it pertained to the PAP, and they, along with elite Russian army forces of the Spetznas of their 70th Special Purposes Detachment, along with their VVS helos and crews, would together move onto the Edwards Plateau to annihilate this militia group, as it was seen as a possible threat that could emerge later during the occupation and economic exploitation of the nation, as the CCP regime could not tolerate any resistance whatsoever at all within their new colony. They were already in the phase of planning and in their next operations, in other words, to destroy these forces anywhere found, as all militia groups that the regime of America had kept tabs on were all known by the coalition, and one by one, at least those they didn't fight right away, they would attempt to hunt down and annihilate, as they already were planning to get those on the Edwards Plateau that were immediately west of the Austin AO, or Battlespace. However, the situation would develop a bit differently. The Americans would actually be on the attack. They would inadvertently, as they were not aware that they were about to be hunted down, they would inadvertently attack first. And their target would be a heavily fortified Russian installation, effectively the headquarters battalion of one of two brigades comprising the 207th Motor Rifle Division, as each of these battalions sat on CCP regime properties that were essentially like FOBs by this point, as they had been heavily stashed with the brigade logistics of each and every brigade, and they were the brigade command centers, as one brigade's forces operated in the north and the other brigade's forces operated in the south. And the northern brigade forces would have their headquarters battalion, which was their command elements, their logistical and support elements, as well as their administrative elements of the entire brigade that were based on this CCP regime property. That was a massive factory farming disguised facility. It was essentially disguised as a large factory farming operation, as these were not the standard barns that were found on small private farms. No, these were enormous factory farming barns, and over the decades that the CCP regime had owned the properties, excavations had been done in each and every one of these buildings in secret, and all the excavated earth gradually removed. Different floors were put in and were stashed to the brim with the brigade's logistical assets, and there were lift systems to bring them up to the top floor to hand off to the forces to truck them out to the different battalions that required them. Each and every battalion had its own headquarters company, which had the battalion's logistics, but the headquarters companies of all these combat battalions had nothing compared to what the brigade headquarters had in terms of logistics. Although they did have ample logistics on their original CCP regime properties, they effectively were not anything like what the brigade headquarters battalions possessed, what they sat upon in their CCP regime properties, as both brigade headquarters battalions sat in areas that were disguised as massive factory farming operations in order to camouflage these enormous logistical bases. As the invasion had officially kicked off and the muster and assemble call had gone out even before the invasion began, all of the support troops of each and every company, there was a mechanic company, a maintenance company effectively, there was the combat drone company, there was a military police company tasked with security of the entire facility, which operated the Russian version of the Tiger MRAPs, as they had their own MRAPs called the Tiger, not to be confused with the Chinese Tiger MRAPs. But the Russian Tiger MRAPs were operated by the Russian MPs on the facility. The entire facility had a tall, multi-strand barbed wire fencing, as this was common around these types of farming operations. It did not raise any eyebrows or elicit any suspicion, nor did the portable buildings, which actually housed very sensitive electronic and communications equipment for the command staff, which lived in the ranch house. And this enormous portable metal building that was constructed, like many that were found on rural properties all over the nation, this one was exceptionally large and had multiple bays for working on vehicles. This maintenance company within this headquarters battalion was the brigade-level maintenance forces. These were the forces that took care of the most troubling mechanical failures and cases and damages. These mechanics handled the worst of the worst. Although there were the company-level mechanics and even platoon-level mechanics, when vehicles were effectively in a lot of mechanical trouble, they went to the brigade and they worked on them. There was also the medical company who had a surgical center and the combat medics vehicles located in this facility as well. The combat engineers of their brigade's combat engineer battalion had briefly, before the invasion really got in full swing, had briefly assisted in further fortifying the facility by laying out concertina wire fencing, at least on two sides of the facility. The side facing the high ground of the Edwards Plateau and the side wherein the entryway was. They also laid a small minefield in a crescent shape in order to channel all friendly vehicles through the gravel driveway, but no hostiles would know about it, so if they tried to enter, they would step on mines. Or if vehicles tried to drive over them, and civilian vehicles, they would destroy the tires and effectively immobilize the vehicle. As this area was fortified in rapid form, but not fully, the combat engineers had to return back to their battalion, which was clearing Lakeway and then laying the PMP pontoon bridge before going into the city to assist the PAP in clearing I-35. However, now that the AO was secured and the brigadier general over the entire brigade was consulting with the divisional commander, who was in constant contact with the Chinese, and of course, the 2nd Combined Arms Army commander, who was located in San Antonio, more plans were being created, along with the assistance of the real-time AI battlefield data processing network, in how to go about crushing all dissenting forces that still were left anywhere near the original AOs of the San Antonio Battlespace, the Austin Battlespace, and even the Fort Hood Battlespace to the north. As all of these forces worked together as it pertained to all the Trojan shock forces throughout the I-35 corridor, especially those who were in areas of operations that were neighboring one another, the planning to use the PAP, which were again like elite shock infantry forces that were specialized in crushing insurgencies, and the elite Russian Spetznas forces were planning on the following day, day 2 of the invasion, October the 5th, going into the cave systems and after the American militia-type forces. However, these forces had plans of their own, as they had been in the cave system all day and had sent scouts who were highly disciplined, as many of these personnel, as it pertained to the Americans, were former armed forces. Some of them were even combat veterans of the prior wars, and they knew a little something about combat, so they were effective fighters in terms of firefights and conducting tactical operations as far as tactical formations and all of that. However, not all of them had this level of experience, but they wanted to join the group anyhow, and they had, since there were no communications due to the tandem anti-satellite cyber strikes, they had already pre-designated a meeting spot in case something like that were to ever happen. This group had very organized and capable leadership who knew what to do in a communications down situation. They had enormous cave complexes throughout the entire Edwards Plateau. Some had massive chambers within them, and this group had a certain cave that they would all meet in, all several thousand of them. And the group would effectively go all up and down the line, passing information as they planned and schemed their next move. They had seen the Russian logistical forces as a ripe target for the picking, as the Russians were non-combat troops. Yes, they were armed and relatively heavily with their tripod-mounted 12.7mm DSHKs in the sandbag emplacements that were quickly constructed as the invasion began, as it did not take much time at all for over 100 men filling sandbags to create walls of them. These forces were, again, armed, but they were not frontline combat troops. Therefore, the American forces seen them as ripe for the picking, and plus their group needed logistics anyway. They needed supplies to continue the fight. They needed MREs, they needed water, they needed food, they needed whatever they could get. They had abandoned all their vehicles near the cave entryways as the invasion was getting kicked off and all the comms went down. That was the sign to the group members to head for the caves. The pre-designated arrangement was to meet at the caves and basically plan their operations, as they had scouts that used the cave system to camouflage their movements as well as their IR signature with mylar and also coniferous pine material that they wrapped around themselves. This helped keep them clear from the nearly ubiquitous surveillance grid of all the quadcopters at the squad level that each and every solitary Russian squad possessed, and were all in the air at the time, mapping the entire surroundings in real time of this installation, as this installation stayed on high alert, even though much of the fighting in the Austin AO had wrapped up. The invasion was still ongoing. It was not over yet. The invasion was only nearing the end the first day. There was another battle about to begin, as the Americans would conduct a plan that was actually well thought out and intelligent. In theory, it would have worked outstanding, but in practice, it was different. The coalition, with their overwhelming firepower from the air, from artillery, from tactical ballistic missiles, even cruise missiles, also combat drones and loitering munitions, and ground-based firepower, it was simply all too much. And the Americans were attacking a fortified area. They were attacking an area of heavy machine gun emplacements, even general-purpose machine guns that were carried by some of the troops, like the PKMs carried by some of the troops. This was the standard rifle, the AK-74M. But also the RPKs, as in the light machine guns, the RPK-74s, carried by some of the light machine gunners of each and every squad of these support troops that were non-combat troops. As they would have to contend with all of this firepower upon attacking this fortified installation, they would also know that they needed to get in as close as possible, as fast as possible, to negate some of the heavy firepower of the coalition forces, because they would not likely drop enormous payloads on their own troops, nor would they fire enormous artillery salvos at their own troops, or missiles or anything else. So their plan involved great speed as it pertained to the technicals and all-terrain vehicle-based forces, and also stealth, because there would be foot-based forces that would use the cave systems to get as close as possible to the Russian installation before attacking it, as they had spied on it all day long from within the caves higher up on the Edwards Plateau cliffs. And as they had reported back to the militia leadership, they had conducted the plan, they had created it, concocted it, and were now carrying it out. However, as they all emerged to the west of this map, getting in their technicals and beginning to emerge en masse, as this was a large force, this was a large grouping of Americans, 3,000 was a massive force, and on this map is approximately half of that force, 1,500, as this is what 1,500 people effectively looks like. As this, again, was a massive force, and there were more off the map, the same number as what's on this map, the coalition had spotted them immediately with their high-altitude assets, all of their high-altitude drones, including the unarmed high-altitude Chinese WZ-7, the unarmed high-altitude Russian 4-post drone, and the high-altitude armed recon drone, the CH-4A. All of these high-altitude drones monitored this entire area in real time, along with the quadcopter drones that were squad-based, and also for the PAP forces present platoon-based, and they had satellite overlays, all creating a real-time, by-the-second moving image of the real-life battlefield, plotting enemy positions on all the combat data links, including those that were carried by the NCOs at the squad level in a PDA format. This for the Russians and for the Chinese forces. as the PAP forces and PLA, of course, all had the same technologies, as the Chinese were the leader in AI and the Russians were not very far behind, and both had integrated all their systems for this invasion. And both were very advanced in technology. And this integration of ISR assets with AI would prove exceedingly deadly for the American forces, as the AI could put together strike packages for the artillery forces, air power, and even missile forces all in real time, and assist the ground forces in their movements and advising them where exactly to move and deploy their troops and vehicles for the attack. For the embattled forces, they would hold down the fort, as the saying went, and fend off waves of attackers coming out of the thickly wooded areas, firing their heavy 12.7 millimeter machine guns, which would rip through the body armor, including the sappy plates, even the steel ones that some wore, and rip out the innards of these attackers. Also, literally tear their head apart. And the blasts would throw personnel and their body parts in multiple directions. This was high-intensity warfare. It was hellishly destructive, as rocket-propelled grenades, loitering munitions, and missiles coming from combat drones would be flying in and hitting the American assault force, as this entire militia force would put up the best fight they could, considering the circumstances they faced, which were hellacious. The massive sledgehammer that was the coalition firepower would come down hard upon them as they attacked this well-fortified installation that would hold its own with heavy machine gun fire, not just from the sandbag tripod-mounted emplacements, but also from the riflemen, the cooks, the mechanics. Everybody would pick up their rifle and fire over the sandbags or in the prone position to fend off the Americans who would try to get through the wire and infiltrate the installation. As Americans would get close to the wire, in some cases, loitering munitions would be striking right outside the installation, as the loitering munitions would be fired by the combat drone company, which also was part of the headquarters battalion and was in this installation with their different options of warheads for their loitering munitions, which would be set on AI target-seeking mode, guided at all times by the AI that was integrated into the quadcopter, high-altitude, and satellite assets to guide these on AI target-seeking mode into their targets, as they had the option of fragmentation warheads, HE warheads, heat warheads, which were excellent on heavily armored vehicles, and thermobaric warheads, which was an additional option that the Chinese didn't have for their loitering munitions. However, the Russians would opt to use the fragmentation warheads to do maximum destruction to infantry-type forces, including even their technicals, which would effectively be annihilated even by the fragmentation warheads, as these were exceedingly destructive against these type of forces. Letting loose an entire company's worth of these at a time would cause immense destruction on any attacking force, even a massive one like this attacking all at once. As the Russians had a mechanized infantry battalion occupying Bee Cave, a outer suburb just to the northeast, the battalion, effectively, this mechanized infantry battalion, was split up into its multiple companies, two of which were relatively close to the headquarters battalion and could be called in as reinforcements if needed. Also, there was a single company that was sent from the Shorad battalion to bolster the headquarters battalion, and the company would be arriving at the same time as the attack was underway at 2200 hours. Before the attack even got underway, in the 30 minutes that all the movements were occurring, where Americans were moving through the high ground as quickly as they could, they were coming out of the cave systems to attack the perimeters. They were even crossing the streets and moving into areas to attack other sides of the installation. The local in the area, the Wing Loon 2 dedicated combat drones that were out of the 10 that were dedicated to the entire battle space that were within this area had moved into the area to assist their Russian allies, along with the combat drone company lobbing all of their Lancet 3s at once from their Track 5 rail-based systems. And as these Wing Loon 2s fired the devastating missiles, such as the anti-tank missile, which was highly destructive, including against infantry and buildings, called the HJ-10, as well as also the CM502KG, which was so powerful in terms of penetration that it could penetrate battleship armor and was thus a dual-purpose anti-ship, anti-tank missile, they would fire these at the ground targets that they had locked onto as soon as possible, including helping the Russian military police platoon that ran out of the gate and got into the prone position. All of these forces guided by the real-time battlefield data processing system, as they had the PDA versions of the combat data links, were firing with heavy machine gun support from above them, coming from both the Tiger MRAPs, one even blocking the gate as an extra precaution, and those in the machine gun nests, including the nest guarding the gateway. These forces would get very close to the main entrance, as many would run through the minefields and lose limbs as they would be thrown into the air, and many would fall and snap their necks, and others would lose legs, and some would fall back on another mine and it would simply annihilate them. But as they ran through this minefield, they were getting nearer to the main entrance, to the opening of the concertina wire, and the Russian MPs were fighting as hard as they could, firing their AK-74M rifles, their RPK-74 light machine guns of the light machine gunners. They were firing the 25mm grenade tubes that some possessed beneath their rifles. As the Chinese had the 35mm grenades, the Russians had the 25s. They were firing frantically to try to hold off these enormous human waves of American attackers. This alone is 380 personnel. Each and every one of these represents a human being. This was a large attacking force trying to get through the gate. As the Chinese Wing Loon 2 fired 4 HJ-10s at this prong and another 4 at this prong, these massively destructive missiles annihilated dozens of attackers all at once. These were hellishly destructive missiles. And then the Russian loitering munitions came in. However, the American fire was very heavy in this area with their small arms. And even though the Russian MPs were laying in the prone and difficult to hit, the Americans, with so much firepower being laid down, managed to cause wounded and also KIAs among the Russian MPs. They effectively annihilated 2 full squads of Russian troops because they annihilated 2 half squads and they annihilated a complete squad. And the combat medics that ran out the main gate stayed busy tending to the wounded troops. This MP platoon was putting up the best fight they could to guard that gate. It was that serious. They could not allow this attacking force to get anywhere near their command elements, especially the sensitive equipment in the portable buildings, or all of the logistics, which were absolutely priceless to the operations of their brigade. As other Americans had come down the pathways that vehicles could actually navigate and had already gotten into these areas, including all the way over here, they were preparing to become a second wave of attackers. As the first wave, these guys were annihilated right off the bat by a combo of MP fire, heavy machine gun fire, and this platoon from one of 2 companies of the mechanized infantry forces moving into the area. As this platoon moved in to block access to this side of the installation, their vehicles laid down enormous heavy machine gun fire from their MTLB-mounted heavy machine guns, or DSHKs, as well as also their very powerful BMP-3 IFVs, firing their 100mm main weapons, 30mm autocannons, 7.62 by 54 coax, and those that had Concor's ATGM pods fired those as well, as this one possessed it. This BMP-3 in this platoon had 2 Concor's ATGMs in their pods and fired them at these forces. It was full weapons blazing, including with loitering munition strikes, heavy machine gun fire from the installation, and the MPs firing at these attacking forces as well, who didn't even make it all the way across the street. Only these personnel did. And they were all wiped out by all of these fragmentation loitering munitions, all the heavy fire from the military police forces, all the heavy machine gun fire, and the arrival of the mechanized infantry forces with their very powerful vehicles. As this platoon was from a different company than these platoons. This was one mechanized infantry company. A squad of headquarters troops, mostly the supply and mechanics and logistical troops, had checked this house before returning to their star formation with their most powerful vehicles being the Tiger MRAPs guarding the weaker vehicles. They had their command vehicle, which is the diamond vehicle. The diamond-shaped vehicle represents the R149 BMR vehicles, which are command vehicles, which this headquarters battalion has plenty of. And this was the command vehicle of the Air Defense Battalion, the R149 BMR in this diamond vehicle. They also had them for their platoon commands. They also had the Barnaul T, which was the Barnaul T was a multi-purpose radar vehicle, which was utilized in the SHORAD company, with these being the SHORAD vehicles with their missiles, which were air defense missiles, their pan-steer missiles, as well as their dual-purpose, dual 30mm autocannon, because they could use it against ground and air targets, and they were in this area in case they needed to be used against ground targets. But the company remained in their vehicles, including their loader trucks that carried the missiles and loaded them into the pan-steer systems, as well as the radar vehicles, the Barnaul Ts, and the command vehicles, the R149 BMRs. All of these forces remained in their vehicles. This entire company stayed in their vehicles. Most of these troops stayed in, and the returning headquarters troops remounted up in their vehicles. Even the mechanized infantry troops remained in their vehicles and laid down enormous fire on all these attacking forces. As each Russian headquarters platoon of the combat forces, including the tank and mechanized infantry and combat engineers, had their own single section of combat drone operators with their track-based 5-rail system for launching the loitering munitions, the Lancet 3s. They launched a grouping of 5 Lancet 3s at these attacking forces, trying to race down this road to get through and attack the installation from the north, but they would never make it because the Russians had shown up by the time all this movement had occurred, and all these forces had come out of the cave systems and had also moved their vehicles to get close so that they could be a second wave of attack and get in after these sappers, as they were going to use these forces around the outside as sapper-type forces to go in first and effectively remove the barriers and everything that would slow down the attack. And then they would hurry in with their technicals and deploy all the troops out of the technicals to carry out a massive hit-and-run attack. But this would fail, and fail miserably, as in this map, the air power was called in for close air support. And these Russian aircraft, Su-34s, were massive heavy hitters, as each carried 26,000 pounds of ordnance. And the Chinese even added to it by carrying their roughly 9,000 pounds, as they carried just over that amount, and their napalm tanks, which were hellishly destructive on human flesh and vehicles, even buildings. As these forces flew into the area, there were 2 pairs from the Chinese JF-17B squadron that would drop munitions, and there were 4 pairs from the Russian squadron, as there were 2 additional pairs that were on call for other areas if there were other areas in the AO that needed air support. As these forces flew in, on this first drop, on these technicals, as Russian artillery was coming in as well, all these X's are where the different firing batteries of the battalion's artillery, of the divisional artillery battalion that was part of this brigade, as a matter of fact, the BM-21 Grad Battalion, were firing enormous salvos from each of their firing batteries onto this high ground right here to destroy all these American forces. Even ISR and AI-guided tactical ballistic missile strikes came in from the very powerful tactical ballistic missiles known as the Iskander-Ms, which were fired by one of the battalion's firing batteries within the 950th Rocket Brigade, which had, as an entire brigade with all its firing battalions, enormous firepower, and they were capable of firing massive amounts of missiles at a time. But in this occurrence, only a small handful would be fired, as a total of 5 tactical ballistic missiles would be fired from one firing battery. As 2 would land in this area along with enormous Russian rocket strikes. All of these forces, in their many dozens, would be outright annihilated by all of the munitions being dropped. This force got away early on and made it down into the valley below. However, in this area, there were other forces that were about to transit when these tactical ballistic missiles came in. The Russian rocket artillery strikes came in en masse as all the firing batteries let loose into this area, hitting mostly this plateau right here and this area right here, wrecking all these vehicles, as the Iskander-M also came into this area to destroy these forces, and another one hitting this area right here with all of these Russian airdropped munitions, many thousands of pounds. And although there were 1,500 American attackers on this 2.5 mile north to south by 1 mile east-west map, as they were spread out in a large area, this didn't stop the rest of their forces from being outright annihilated by a massive Chinese rocket barrage from their PHL-03 battalion in Nolanville from the Fort Hood battle. It was part of the PLA 68th Group Army, firing as a battalion-wide effort with 48 of these systems firing at one time into a 2 by 2 mile area, totally saturating this entire area with 300 millimeter rocket fires. They totally annihilated 1,500 American combatants as they had emerged from the caves and were getting into their vehicles to become a third wave of attack, as this would be the second wave, as the first wave was the sappers that had come out of the cave systems. However, as the rockets came down from the Chinese artillery, it was simply gargantuan, the amount of destruction that 48 of those systems could carry out at one time. As the Chinese air power came in, they dropped their napalm tanks in the orange, as well as their napalm canisters, as well as 4,000 pounds of HE onto these forces below, and this was the spread of the napalm from their napalm strikes, simply annihilating all these personnel in the wooded areas with the HE mixed in, blasting massive blasts. They outright wiped these forces off the map, along with the heavy machine gun fire coming in from the Russian Tiger MRAP gunners on their gun turrets, and the heavy machine gun mounted on the tripod in the sandbag emplacement, as well as all the riflemen that were firing through the wire as well, and in between these vehicles, firing in the prone position any way they could. As the airstrikes were the final blow against these forces, simply taking them out of the battle entirely, they lit this entire wooded area on fire with the napalm, and anybody that was still somehow alive would have been smoked out by a massive fire that was now started in that area. As these forces had emerged from a cave system, the Russian mechanized infantry forces were wiping them out with heavy machine gun fire from the vehicles, even assistance from the FOB from the fortified compound, as the Tiger MRAPs from the military police and this machine gun emplacement with a bunch of riflemen firing over the sandbags were assisting the mechanized infantry forces, who really could have handled this all on their own anyway because of their sheer power of their vehicles, especially their 100 millimeter main gun on their BMP-3, as well as a 30 autocannon and anti-tank missiles. And the heavy machine guns on the MTLBs was just an extra addition, as these machine guns were anti-materiel weapons and were very destructive against human beings, especially, as they blew people into pieces and effectively splattered them all over the field of battle. As these enormously powerful heavy machine guns were letting loose into this area, the Russian forces were also getting heavy assistance on the plateau from the Chinese rocket strikes that were hitting mostly off the map and destroying a massive area, with the air power coming in and simply annihilating everything on the plateau, including with tactical ballistic missile strikes, which were simply the proverbial cherry on top. As these forces here were hit by both Russian airstrikes and Chinese airstrikes. Only over here was the Chinese airstrikes with reverberating blast radius strikes from the rockets hitting in this area. These forces were outright annihilated by all of this firepower. And over here, this aircraft had dropped 6,000 pounds first on these forces down here before quickly releasing another load of 8,000 pounds onto this group right here, while the Chinese aircraft was dropping its payload and this aircraft was dropping its payload, while these two got those in the lower ground in the wooded area. Over here, the Russians each dropped 10,000 pounds at a time. This was not even close to their entire payload. They still had 16,000 pounds aboard each of these aircrafts of air-to-ground munitions. Same over here, 10,000 each. These forces were annihilated, including the massive warheads that were on the tactical ballistic missiles. And also, rocket strikes impacted this area from one of the firing batteries firing into this particular part of the ridge, along with the massive Chinese rocket strikes and the rocket and tactical ballistic missile and airstrikes in this area here. It simply annihilated all of these forces. And these were the only ones that got away because at the opening of the map they had made it down here. As these forces tried to bum rush the main gate, they were being heavily fired upon by the Tiger MRAPs, concentrating their fire on these forces and these forces trying to run through the gate. And fortunately, the minefield definitely slowed down these attacking prongs, and enough for the loitering munitions to really get in there and finish them off, along with the Winglung 2 firing very powerful HJ-10 anti-tank missiles into these two prongs, along with loitering munition strikes moving in as well. All of this was hellishly devastating. Although the military police guarding the front gate took a beating, the Americans suffered far, far worse. As these were non-combat troops, but they had enormous resources at their disposal. These Winglung 2s destroyed prongs of attack, as well as other would-be attackers in the distance. And as these forces had made it down and were to become a second wave, as these first waves were immediately destroyed by concentration of loitering munitions and firepower, also from this mechanized infantry platoon moving into the area to block any would-be attackers against the eastern side of the compound. The other platoons had now moved in. As this platoon originated off-map, it was firing at these forces in an L vector of fire, a tactical, perfect L vector of fire between these vehicles firing and these vehicles firing, and then this platoon as well would move in with its vehicles, and the third platoon to move in with its vehicles would dismount all 5 of its mechanized infantry squads, who would receive generous artillery support from the Howitzer Artillery Battalion of the other brigade within the 207th, as the 207th had 2 divisional artillery battalions, one the BM-21 Grad Battalion of the Brigade Headquarters Battalion, who was under attack, and the other being the Howitzer Battalion of the 2S19 MSTAs, and they would fire precision strikes guided by the ISR assets, as always, for these Russian forces, these dismounted Russian mechanized infantry troops, who would be wiping out the rest of the American forces. As these reinforcements had come into the battle, including these forces up here, who never even dismounted their squads, although they could have, which would have added enormous extra firepower against these forces, but it was unnecessary, as tactical ballistic missiles, mammoth airstrikes, and enormous rocket strikes, including even Russian rocket strikes in this area, came in and wiped all these human beings off the map. Many thousands of innocent people were also annihilated by the Chinese strikes as well, as a 2x2 mile area was thoroughly saturated, which included non-combatants in their homes. Everybody was annihilated in that 2x2 mile area. There were no settlements in this area, but these ridges on the Edwards Plateau were hit heavily, exceedingly heavily, by these Russian assets and also Chinese assets from the PLAAF, including the napalm strikes, which started fires in this wooded area right here along this ridge line. And the Winglung 2s added even more firepower to the mix. However, now that the battle had effectively been won, and as far as protecting the embattled installation from the attacking forces, who were actually very intelligent in crafting their plan, but in the execution of it, they failed miserably. As the coalition was in full alert mode, as their tempo of operations had not slowed down whatsoever at all. They were still in full-scale invasion mode. This was still high-intensity warfare. These forces were heavily prepared for any eventuality. They were even planning on going after these American forces using their elite Spetznas battalion, the 70th Special Purposes Detachment, including with their full VVS Helo support, and the elite paramilitary infantry forces of the People's Armed Police collaborating with them to annihilate armed reactionary civilian elements who could resist the economic exploitation and colonization by the Chinese of America. And the Russian allies, although they got their own territory in the Arctic Circle, were still more than happy to stick it out with the Chinese allies, as they were essentially blood brothers at this point in terms of their nations and their alliance. However, the Russians would eventually pull out of America, and the Chinese and some remaining allies would fight a very, very long counterinsurgency that would result in tens of millions of American deaths and tens of millions of more enslaved, either to work in laogai in America or sent back to China to work in factories, as the free labor force was another benefit of the Chinese economic exploitation of the nation. And the Russians would stay with them for 6 months in the lower 48 before they would pull their troops back to their new territories in the Arctic Circle that they had an immense amount of resources in to harvest. And they would also essentially make the local American and Canadian populations into Russians. They would effectively assimilate them forcefully, make them learn Russian and learn the culture, and make them become Russian citizens to boost Russia's population and to use them as part of a growing workforce, as the resources would be fully exploited in the north by the Russians, and in the lower 48 the Chinese would brutally enslave the local population, which would cause the resentment in the hearts of the Americans to burn wildly, which would cause this insurgency to last for years, but it would result as a meat grinder for many lives, mostly American, although the Chinese would eventually get war-weary fighting so long for this new territory that they sought to exploit. As these Russian forces were holding out within their installation, as reinforcements had arrived in the form of the very potent Russian mechanized infantry companies and their arrival with their very powerful vehicles and troops that were heavily armed, the artillery, the air power, and even the PLA's artillery with the 300mm rocket strikes, and even the Russian tactical ballistic missile strikes with the Iskander-Ms, including one that would land here and destroy about 80 Americans that were in the area, as they were relatively well spread out. The Russian artillery would also impact this area too and destroy this entire farm, as the Iskander-M would land here and annihilate about 80 of these attackers at once, while the rest would move through this area before the Iskander had impacted and would be struck by ISR-guided artillery, precision artillery fired from the 2S-19 MSTA batteries, firing their very powerful 152 shells in support of their dismounted Russian mechanized infantry troops that were moving to clear the area of American resistance. As they dismounted their forces in this area, the vehicles would remain where they were, and one squad would move here and one squad would move here to watch this field of fire, along with the vehicles, staggered weapons, their quadcopters out patrolling, mapping the area in real time. They knew where these Americans were, and they were hunting them down as they bounded in short bounds, bounding and covering tactically, where one would move and fire let the other move, and he'll lay down, lay covering fire, then the other would move. All three of these squads coordinated their bounds and covers together. As they got to the very end, this grouping of Americans had moved to this position here, and they were closing with them in grenade range and throwing hand grenades and finishing off the last of these American forces, as they also were firing RPG vampires at other American forces, including those trying to come around this house and attack these squads as they were earlier up here. But the artillery had been called in and annihilated these forces, along with the Iskander strike, which was utterly devastating and left a massive crater in the middle of the forest. And 80 were killed and many more were maimed and would die due to not receiving medical attention. Again, they were well spread out. Otherwise, the Iskander, if they were more concentrated, would have destroyed far more of them, likely the entire group, had they all been far more condensed. It must be understood at all times, this is a 1 mile wide area, so in terms of scale, this area is more wide than it appears, and these personnel are spread out more wide than they appear, so this Iskander, though, would have left a massive crater. It would have annihilated them if they would have all been together, but they were all well spread out, which effectively caused these Russians to get into firefights with these American forces here that were moving through this area, and there were even 15 more Americans coming in from this area, that these squads were engaging in their wedge formations, which was the perfect formation for engaging these forces, including these original forces that were in this area and moved into this wooded area here, who were all savagely hit by artillery fire from the 152mm artillery from the 2S19 MSTA strikes, as these howitzers fired their very powerful 152 shells, and exceedingly accurately, as the artillery was precision. It was on point. It was steel on target. All of it guided by the quadcopter ISR assets of each and every squad and vehicle crew of the Russian army. As these strikes came in and decimated these vehicles and foot-based personnel alongside of the fire they received from these Russian forces in their wedge formations, including destroying this grouping right here. As they were at this position, they were closing with them. This squad on the end was closing with them, meaning they were bounding ever closer and still coordinating their movements with these other two squads. And as they got within grenade range, they finished off the last 5 of these Americans because they were steadily closing with them and laying heavy fire on them as they moved. They were bounding and covering, and when they would get near them, they would get in the prone position or in the kneeling position, and they would fire their weapons, including their heavy weapons like their RPG vampires or 25mm grenades beneath some of the rifles of the men that carried those. Some of the men possessed those tubes. And as they closed with these American forces and annihilated them, and their quadcopters scouted the area, providing exact coordinates for artillery strikes and even the Iskander strike, which annihilated 80 of these attackers at once, the rest of these forces, including those in the ATVs, were simply annihilated by this artillery shell here and one here. And the 15 that came in here, and this group were the last to effectively be wiped out by these Russian forces. This squad, after wiping these forces out, coordinating their fire with these two squads coordinating their fire together against these personnel, when these personnel were coming in, this squad closed with them and finished off these 15, while this squad on the end finished these personnel off here. These forces here were wiped out by the time these squads were all right here laying down fire in their wedge formations in multiple directions, as again, that was an outstanding tactical formation for firing in 2 or even 3 directions. As a wedge formation, you can fire on this side and the other personnel can fire on this side, or you can fire straight. Everyone can fire straight, or fire on this side with the point man firing straight. It was an excellent attack formation, and these forces crushed these Americans with the assistance of their ISR assets, as each and every one of their squad level NCOs carried the PDA version of the combat data link. And as all of these American forces were wiped out by a combination of various firepower, including all the aviation-based assets, which were mammothly destructive, enormously destructive. As these forces were spread out, had they been more concentrated, this was a large area, 2.5 by 1 mile area. Had they been more concentrated, it wouldn't have even taken this many 1,000-pounders to wipe them all out, or it would have only taken a few Iskanders. But the Americans were at least intelligent enough to basically distribute their forces in a wide force distribution to effectively spread them far and wide and attack in that type of manner to mitigate the damage caused by artillery or even the air power, although the air power delivered very heavy strikes. But also, even the humble loitering munition with its fragmentation warhead could destroy an entire squad of troops at a time, or even destroy a tank or an infantry fighting vehicle if it had a heat warhead, or lighter armored vehicles with an HE warhead plus personnel. And these had multiple options, even a thermobaric warhead for destroying fortifications. These were very destructive weapons, the loitering munitions, and everything was ISR guided from the humble rifleman and his fire to the loitering munition strikes to the machine gunners and their vectoring of fire, because the vectoring, angle, and traverse of fire was of the utmost importance as these Russian forces and American forces clashed on the modern, fluid battlefield, as the Americans would take enormous casualties, as virtually their entire force would be wiped off the map, as these Russian forces closed with the last of them by this farm, firing 25mm grenades, RPG Vampires, rifle fire, light machine gun fire from RPK-74s, even remaining loitering munitions that would strike them as they hadn't as of yet hit a target on AI target seeking mode. There was an enormous volume of firepower available to these mechanized infantry troops, and they would take the fullest advantage of it and even use their vehicle-based fires as well, like they did in the north, to annihilate this grouping of vehicles and this grouping of troops emerging from the cave system. They were all annihilated by the combo of loitering munitions and this enormously powerful vehicle-based firepower, as these vehicles annihilated these forces, and even the fortifications and the Tiger MRAP gunners assisted in this by firing and vectoring fire at these forces. Angle and traverse and vectoring of fire. Even the Panstier company didn't even, or battery rather, didn't even have to participate, because the mechanized infantry companies had it all handled by themselves, effectively, although all of the heavy loitering munition support, air support, tactical ballistic missile support, and Chinese enormous 300mm rocket support effectively assisted in winning the day, as all of these forces working together could take on any force that was thrown at them with ease, as the sheer force of arms of the coalition was monumental, to say the least. That was in fact the least of the words that could be used to describe it. It was simply massive. This was total war. This was full-scale war. This was not low-intensity warfare. This was full-scale, full weapons blazing, high-intensity conflict. Mass destruction. Mass death. It was totally nihilistic, as in completely making everything into nothingness. The hypothetical fourth-generation warfare doctrine invasion of America will continue with the Battle of San Antonio next.